Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. If you could all find your way to a seat, please. All right. So thank you all very much for coming out today. My name is Caitlin, and I am the executive director here at the Matheson History Museum. I've got a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, I want to thank our sponsors, Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, the City of Gainesville, and the State of Florida Division of Cultural Affairs. They are some of our grant funding agencies that make our exhibits and programs possible. But the other side of that is you, our members and donors. So I know that several of you did make some donations when you were registering for your tickets, so thank you very much. That helps to help us continue the work that we're doing. I'm also going to make a shameless sales plug because tomorrow is the Amazing Give. This is a community-wide giving day for Gainesville and Alachua County. There are over 100 local nonprofits that participate, so no matter what you're interested in, I'm sure there's somebody that you would like to support. I would love for it to be us. But we are raising money this year to digitize our postcard collection. There are flyers around the room and information in your programs. But we have here at the Matheson over 20,000 historic postcards from Florida, and about 4,200 of those are Gainesville and Alachua County. So we are raising money to digitize those and make them more publicly accessible through our online collections database. So that is something that I hope you'll consider supporting. Donations are open. Tomorrow is the giving day, and donations will remain open for several days afterwards. So that is my shameless sales pitch. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. She is the daughter of Rae Weimer, and she graduated from the University of Florida with a Bachelor of Arts with high honors in psychology, a Master of Science in psychology, and a PhD in clinical psychology. Almost 20 years later, she completed a postdoctorate in neuropsychology at the San Francisco VA Medical Center in California. She has devoted her entire career to serving children and adults with disabilities, first at Monroe Developmental Center in Rochester, New York, then at the California School for the Deaf in Fremont, California, in addition to her private neuropsychology practice. Ann and her husband, James, reside in Fairfield, California. So we are really delighted to welcome Ann to talk to us about her book and her father. So thank you, and I'll turn the microphone over now.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you all for coming. Before I start, one of my classmates in the back asked me how I came to write this book, and that's what I'm going to tell you about tonight. First of all, without the urging and personal contacts of my good friend, Dr. Bruce Steckmiller, who was a classmate of mine in Gainesville High School and also knew my father, I do not think this book would have come to fruition. My husband, Jim Solar, and I were visiting Bruce and his wife, Dr. Joyce Steckmiller, in November of 2021 at their beach place. And Bruce was urging me to write my father's life story. Bruce was particularly intrigued by the fact that my father worked for PM Newspaper, one of the most experimental, innovative newspapers in the 20th century in the United States. It's sort of ignoring Bruce's challenge, I went home, and then I decided to see if I had any material that would be relevant. So I found a box of 400 pages that had been transcribed from cassettes that my dad dictated at the urging of my brother and myself. We wanted him to tell his life story, so he dictated those on cassette tapes. And then they were transcribed by Wilma Parvin, who later became Dad's wife. So I started reading, and I was fascinated by tales of his early life in a small Midwestern town in Nebraska. And because of that, I thought, hey, this is really interesting. I thought I would write a story.
Just 1 second.
Nothing. Okay. So I do regret, though, that I did not read this manuscript when my father was still alive so that I could have asked him about his feelings and his reactions to things that happened to him in the early 20th century. Not only did I have these transcribed pages, but my father saved every magazine clipping, newspaper clipping, so I had those. I had all the letters from colleagues. I had the founder of PM Newspapers, memos, and prospectus. I also had some theses that were written by students at the College of Journalism, and I used all of that to write the book. However, sometimes when we get older, we recollect very clearly some things that happened. So when Dad would mention something, I decided to go online and do research and check out his references. And so this became a history lesson for me as well. My father was born in 1903 in Nebraska, in the small town of Mason City, where the streets were not paved, there was no electricity initially, and there was no indoor plumbing, and they relied on horse and buggy for their transportation. Dad's depiction of life during this early part of the 20th century in a small Midwestern community that relied mostly on agriculture and livestock for their livelihoods was particularly intriguing. Dad would mention all of these things, and I really found them fascinating. Obviously, this information would be of interest to me as his daughter, but why did I think this might be of interest to anyone else? First of all, it's not exactly a story of rags to riches, but it does show what an individual can do when they have a positive outlook on life, when they have the gift of resourcefulness, and when they have the ability to face life's adversity and carry on without giving up, without wallowing in self-pity or blaming someone else or something for their circumstances. Here was a man who lacked the funds to complete college, so he went to work. Someone who preferred vocation of an attorney was not available to him, so he became a journalist. When a job did not work out, he sought another. Never dwelling on the past or what could not be, Dad just had the confidence in himself to carry on and move ahead. I thought telling this kind of a story of an individual would be an inspiration to others and provide an engrossing picture of life in the early 20th century, as well as the story of the College of Journalism and Communications. One of the things that was so phenomenal about Dad was that he did not have a college degree, yet he was hired by the University of Florida to become the head of its department and eventually a dean, although a degreeless one. He was a humble man who did not flaunt his accomplishments, and perhaps he felt out of place initially amidst professors with not only college degrees, but masters and PhDs. When he came to Florida and he went to his first faculty meeting in the College of Arts and Sciences, an English professor asked him, "How do you want to be addressed? Doctor? Professor? Mister?" And Dad just said, "Just call me Ray." So that's how I came up with a title for the book, as well as this became part of Dad's legend. And this is an article that my brother wrote for a paper, The Communicator, about my dad. Coming from pioneer stock, the Weimers had to be very resourceful individuals. Not having a great deal of money, it also necessitated their inventiveness. In his early life in Nebraska, Dad recounted numerous ways that the family found to earn a livelihood and deal with what was lacking in their lives. Some of the things they did was his father was one of the first to know anything about electricity in Mason City. So he helped wire some of the houses when electricity came. He also ran movie houses. He went around the country for a while and then ran them in Mason City, which my dad and his brother did later. My father's mother raised chickens, and she would sell the eggs, and she would also sell the chickens. So they found many ways. My dad broke horses, which they sold to the army. They got rent from some land that they had that other people farmed on. So there were many ways. They were always trying to come up with other ways to earn money. My dad himself had a number of jobs from an early age, and when he was in college, he not only he was a janitor in the girls' dorm, he started the boilers early in the morning, and he worked in the cafeteria. It's hard to say what sets someone on their life path. Dad did not set out, as I've said, to become a journalist. Not only did he enjoy debate, but he excelled in debate and had wanted to be an attorney. But his financial circumstances nixed that possibility. So his first exposure to newspapers was in junior high school when he had a paper route, and he would pull around a little wagon, sometimes through the snow in the winter, to meet his obligations. The second was an experiment with a classmate of his whose father worked for a local paper. And the two boys would go to the print shop at night when no one was around. They would take the metal slugs, as they were called. They would ink them, and they would make out words on the paper to talk about things they thought were funny or gossip from their school on the pages, and then distribute those. Following that, my father also served as editor of his school and college newspaper, as well as yearbook. And then his brother, Doc, also had to drop out of college for financial reasons, and he began going around the Midwest working for newspapers and encouraged my father to join him, as when my father had to drop out of college in his junior year. Their first endeavor, however, was not a fruitful one. When Doc, Dad's brother, heard about a struggling publication in North Platte, Nebraska, they decided to borrow some money from Mason City Bank and purchase the paper. Little did they know how much this paper was in debt. So when they could not obtain enough advertising to make the paper go, they decided to lock the doors, pack their trunks, and leave town. So they moved on to York, Nebraska. So they're sitting in a cafe thinking, well, let's look in this paper and see if we can find some jobs. And there was a headline, Weimer Brothers Disappear. So they decided they better get out of Nebraska altogether. And that's when they went on to the Midwest. Granddad's time during the 1920s and 1930s, he worked at 11 different newspapers across the Midwest, gaining more responsibility and higher positions of authority. And that was how he actually met my mother, which was in Akron, Ohio. My mother, Ruth Meister, was a newspaper woman in her own right. She was working in Oklahoma City as society editor for one of the papers run by a man named Walter Morrow, who also owned the Akron Times-Press, where Dad was working. So Morrow decided to move my mother up to Akron to become society editor there. And the way they met was that the New York City Opera, once they'd finished their regular season, they would tour the country, go around, and there was going to be a famous opera singer in Cleveland. And Morrow wanted my mother to cover the opera. But she needed an escort. So my dad, for two reasons, one, he owned a tux. And I don't know that this is the tux that he owned, but it's the only picture I have of him in a tux, and that became famous as the way he met my mother. It was also his day off. So he escorted Mother to Cleveland to cover the opera. They actually did not marry until 1942 because of circumstances, and this was in 1937 when they met. Because of the influence of people that Dad knew, he was hired to join PM Newspaper, which was founded by a man named Ralph Ingersoll. Ingersoll made his name in the magazine business with the New Yorker, Time, Life, and Fortune. But Ingersoll wanted to start a paper. He wanted to be his own boss and not report to somebody else. He wanted a newspaper that would not take any advertising. He did not want to be beholden to anyone else who would influence him. He wanted to tell the truth. He wanted to support the underdog. And the motto of his paper became, "We don't like anyone who pushes anyone around." And I think that appealed to my dad as well. This paper they wanted to hire the best writers, the best photographers, the best of everything in New York City. And some of the famous people that worked for PM newspaper included Dashiell Hammett, Lillian Hellman, Dorothy Parker, James Thurber, Benjamin Spock, Ted Geisel, or Dr. Seuss, Edna Ferber, Max Lerner, I.F. Izzy Stone, Margaret Bork White, Mary Morris, Fiorello LaGuardia, Walter Winchell, and more. Now, some of these people only stayed for a few months, but this paper did attract some of the best names in the business. One of the other things that they did is they were very innovative. They started publishing maps during the war, and none of the other newspapers in New York City were doing that. You can see an example here. So other newspapers started to copy them because they would map where all the battles were being held, what was happening in Europe, in the Pacific, and that was part of it. Up in the upper right corner, they also supported a lot of causes in New York City. There was brine in some of the meat, and they exposed that. They exposed Shell Oil selling oil to the Nazis. They exposed discrimination in housing. So they really did support the underdog. But because PM took no advertising, they had to earn some money somewhere, so they charged more for their paper. They charged 5 cents versus 2 to 3 cents what the other papers in New York City were charging. The initial investors for this paper read like a Dun and Bradstreet list. They included Marshall Field III, the A&P heir Huntington Hartford III, John Deere heir Dwight Deere Wyman, Philip Wrigley, son of the Wrigley Gum founder, Sears Roebuck heir Marion Stern, Eleanor Gimble, a progressive women's rights advocate and wife of the grandson of the founder of Gimble's department store, along with investment bankers and others. Still, they tended to use all this money in the first year, and so Marshall Field bought these investors out at pennies on the dollar, and he became the supporter of the paper. Despite being subsidized, Marshall Field was focusing more at the time on his paper in Chicago, the Chicago Sun. And he decided they needed to take advertising. Even when they took advertising, they could not make enough money, and the paper had to be sold. So it was sold and became the New York Star, and that too closed. Perhaps that was fortuitous for our family, because my parents did not want to raise my brother and me in the city where we were born. It was too big. They thought a small town would be more amenable to raising a family. In 1949, the newspapermen of Florida, disappointed with the journalism graduates at the time, clamored for the University of Florida to find a real newspaperman who knew how to help people learn the business, not just some academic. So the president of the university at the time, J. Ellis Miller, charged the newspapers to find their own candidate, and they did. Knowing of Dad's reputation in the field, he was invited to Florida for an interview, and he said it was the strangest interview he ever had. The academics did not know what to ask him. They knew nothing about the newspaper business. He didn't know what to tell them. He'd never taught or taken a journalism course in his life, although he had educated those who worked for him in the practicalities of running the paper. So after the interview, Miller asked the newspapermen, "Is this the man you want?" And they said yes, and he was hired. The department at the time was still under arts and sciences. It was not even a school. They had only 3 faculty members, few students, and very few materials. There was one classroom, no typewriters, and one book, a beat-up old dictionary. So Dad, again, had to rely on resourcefulness, which he was good at, and innovation to obtain materials, to revise the curriculum, and to hire more staff. To get typewriters, he actually went and bought some old Army typewriters that were being discarded, but he had to pay almost as much to get them repaired so that they would work. Shortly after his arrival at the University of Florida, journalism became a school in the fall of 1949. And then they moved to another temporary Army barracks buildings, which were very prevalent. And this is a picture of the second home of the school, Building K. And it was still very small. They had a problem with heat. It was not an ideal place. The other thing that Dad did when he came is he availed himself of going to any meeting around the state. He wanted to meet all of the editors of all the newspapers in Florida. The second thing he did was he started offering weekend workshops for high school students, as well as summer seminars at the University of Florida. So the students would come, they'd stay on campus, they'd become familiar with the amenities here, and when it came time for them to consider an institution of higher learning, they thought of the University of Florida. And as Dad said, they came pouring in. The other thing that he did was, because journalism was an upper division, it was upper division for sophomores and seniors, he wanted to keep in touch with the juniors and the freshmen. So he offered electives taught by the journalism staff. One was survey of communications, and one was writing for mass communication. So that kept them in touch, and he made sure that they went into his upper division. With all the new students, the size of the faculty had to be increased. And then a larger facility had to be found with this growing faculty and growing student body. So in 1959, the school then moved to the Florida Stadium. I doubt many of you would recognize this today, but that was their next home, beneath the bleachers. Dad had heard that Ohio State had built dormitories under their stadium, so he thought this would be an ideal place. And he went in and moved over there, but they had a problem. The Florida football players were above them, and sometimes they got a little rambunctious, and they would plug up the drains, and water would come down into one of the studios and ruin the equipment. And for Dad, that was the last straw, and he was able to evict the football players and took over that part of the stadium. Dad also added educational television, broadcasting, advertising, and public relations. So by this time, the University of Florida School of Journalism became the fastest growing in the United States. They also became one of the most acclaimed. In 1960, the Hearst newspapers started giving awards with cash prizes for journalism writing. In 1965, Florida won the national title and was named Best Journalism School in the nation. So Dad, along with President J. Wayne Wrights and Hugh Cunningham, who had taught the winners, were presented with the first Hearst Prize that Florida won by President Lyndon Johnson in Washington, D.C. And since then, the University of Florida has continued to rank among the top 10 schools of journalism in the United States to this day. Because of university policy, Dad was required to step down from his position in 1965. And he decided it was time the school became a college, which it did just before he retired in 1968. So now he was officially a dean, but still a degreeless one. He was the only dean in the United States without a degree. The faculty, after he retired, wanted to seek an honorary degree for Dad. But again, the university had a policy that someone could not be employed. And at that time, Dad was working for President Stephen O'Connell as a special assistant. So when he finally did retire in 1974, he was awarded an honorary doctorate. And now he could be called Dr. Weimer. But a reporter asked him, and Dad told the reporter, "I just hope nobody stops calling me Ray." Perhaps the biggest honor Dad received in his lifetime was the naming of the present-day College of Journalism and Communication home, Weimer Hall. Typically, the Florida Board of Regents does not name a building for a living individual. To this end, 2 state senators sponsored legislation that circumvented this rule, and Dad was allowed to name the building for him, and the building was dedicated in 1981. Unfortunately, my mother had passed away in 1979 and was not here to share the honor with my dad. However, my brother was here, and he provided the invocation and the benediction at the ceremony. In retirement, Dad continued to serve his community and received many awards for his service. He also continued to travel until his health declined. In editing Dad's memoir, I hope I have portrayed the life of a remarkable man, demonstrating what hard work, perseverance, and a positive outlook on life can achieve. Thank you. So do we want to do questions or?
Yes. So, hello, me again. We have people who are watching online. So, as we get into the Q&A section, in order to make sure that everybody is able to hear questions and know what is being answered, if you have a brief question that is short enough for me to remember what it is, I will repeat it into the microphone for you. If you have a longer question, I ask that you please come say it into the microphone yourself. And for those of you online, if you have a question, please put it in the chat and I will share it on your behalf. Yes.
So, as Dean of the College of Journalism, did Dean Weimer ever have a serious controversy over any press issues? Freedom of press.
So this question is whether Dean Weimer had any serious controversies over freedom of the press during his time.
Not to my knowledge.
I'm Robert Mounts, president of the Matheson Museum, and as a student in 1964-65, I was able to write a column for the Florida Alligator, and they recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of the independent Florida Alligator, and I wonder if you can tell how did they get started, and I'm sure it got started through Dean Weimer and the College of Journalism.
That's something I don't particularly remember or know about. I know there was some controversy with the Florida Alligator, but I can't elaborate on that for you.
He took tour groups abroad. Can you talk about that?
So this question is about the tour groups that Dean Weimer took abroad.
In 1957, the university asked Dad to accompany some co-eds as their chaperone to Europe. So he took this group to Europe, and I think he fell in love with travel and decided to come back, and he took a lot of people who knew him, and it was kind of the Weimer tour group. He also was advised that it might be better to have a local group for liability reasons, so he worked with Holbrook Travel here in Gainesville. And almost every other year, he would take a group to Europe. People were familiar with him, and they enjoyed his tours, and they repeated with him over and over on these tours. And he had some interesting adventures. I don't know if you want relate any of those from his first trip, but my brother and I got the travel bug. We went with him in 1961 to Europe, and there were a bunch of young people also on that tour. So for us, it was a great exposure to Europe. And he was also called by one columnist or reporter the Dean of Travel.
Do I see someone in the back?
I have a question. You understand that Ray had flown on the Junior airship, the actor, before I was born. Ray was a baseball coach. Look, we know how he's involved, using the money. So I'd like to know, how did we happen to fly on the lighter than airships in the 1930s?
Okay. Yeah, he was in Akron at the time that the first airship built by the Navy, the Akron, was commissioned. And he told about this story. He actually got to ride in it initially, and then they were going to christen it. Now, when you christen a ship, you usually smash a bottle of champagne over the bow. We couldn't do that with an airship. So what they decided to do was to put some pigeons up in the nose cone of this airship. And they had them there overnight. So the next day, I think this was in August, it was very hot. All the women are there in white dresses. President Hoover's wife, Mrs. Hoover, was there to do the christening. And so they opened the front of the airship, and all of these birds flew out. However, other things flew out along with them, droppings all over the women in their white dresses. And I've never read about that anywhere in any books. I have a book on the airships. That was never mentioned. But my dad mentioned this, and the news people thought it was pretty funny. I'm sure the women did not. And one other thing you sort of mentioned, but I wanted to elaborate on, I don't know how many people, you could probably see it in some of these pictures. My dad's right hand was permanently in this position. When he was about 15 and riding a horse, he was thrown from the horse and broke his arm. And when they set it, they didn't do it properly, and the bone was kind of shoved all the way up, and the cast was left on, and at that time they didn't have x-rays, so they didn't know what was happening underneath, and the nerves were killed. So the cast came off, and he couldn't move it at all. So he went to Omaha later, and a doctor did some motive surgery, and he actually had some use. He could hunt and peck, kind of, let's see, I don't know, like this with his arm. He could use a finger to pick up a suitcase. It became so strong. And when people would go to shake his hand, he would just put out his left hand as if nothing was wrong. And it never really, I mean, I don't think about him as being handicapped because he never let it bother him. That's just another example of his positive outlook and how he did not let adversity interfere with his life.
Okay, any last takers? All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. I will be at the table in the back. I would love to sell you a copy of the book, and then Anne will be at the table up front, ready to sign it for you.